the recording again. Right. So this part is going to be around interviewing and focus groups. And obviously we've got two seasoned researchers with us, Piers and Sarah. So can I just start by asking the two of you, given that you've done interviews in the past, what has been the most challenging part of interviewing? Any of the two?
Well, when you say seasoned, we did only do one interview.
You shouldn't have said that, Sarah. You are what you claim to be.
Well, this is true. No. But in terms of the research, yeah, we conducted research last year in different groups. So my research was about university students' perceptions of drinking alcohol, and we had to create a semi-structured interview schedule with 10 questions, and then recruit one participant, and then within our group we had 10 participants then to use for our data. So the most challenging thing I would say is probably designing the questions in a way that you're going to get a lot out of the participants. So making sure you're not asking them closed questions, and you're asking them questions which is going to really engage them and get them thinking. And then probably managing your own state, so making sure that you're not leading them, that you're not saying too many times, because you have to transcribe it and get everything down, and then you're not doing something in one interview that you're not prepared to do in all of the interviews, so that you have really balanced data, I would say. Okay.
I think comments around that is that when you think about interviews, and interviewing is more like there has to be a flow, there has to be a story. Common mistakes, for example, people make is that they have this semi-structured in front of them, and what they try to stick to that whatever happens. So, for example, participants might deviate from that flow, and what you have down as question 8 might be answered under question 5, and then the person that's doing the interview gets confused, and they try to stick to the schedule, and that disrupts the flow of the conversation. It's a conversation, and through that conversation you can get your interviewee to relax, to basically get them in the right mindset. There is also sometimes experienced interviewers are doing body mirroring as well, so they're using neurolinguistics, so they can basically get their interviewees to kind of relax and open up. So I think moving away from the questions to maintain a flow while at the same time trying to cover the material is probably one of the most challenging things. And you know, you need to remember that it is a conversation. You need to have a flow. At the same time, you need to get answers to your questions, but you shouldn't be letting the questions driving the flow of the conversation, in a sense.
Okay.
Piers?
Yeah, I have found similar things to Sarah, but also it was striking the balance of letting it take its flow and not completely derailing the conversation, because people, like I noticed, participants tend to just drag in all their relevant experience, and sometimes it's hard to strike the balance between staying focused and not.
What happened then after the 10 interviews? Did each one of you analyze one interview, or did you analyze all 10 interviews?
We had access to all of the transcripts from our group, so then we each analysed all of it, and then we came back together to sort of pick out themes and to code, and then we wrote our own reports. So there was like dipping in and out of the group work, really.
It's almost like that has been also a form of triangulation, kind of, because one of the interesting things with that is that you get the transcriptions. Different researchers look at the different transcriptions, and they get their own sense of what the interview looks like, and then what happens is you can basically share, and you can look at each other's notes, so you can verify or not that schedule. So that's quite interesting. And
yeah, we definitely noticed that like some people would draw more, like focus more on one particular theme that had come up, which maybe I hadn't even noticed. So it was good to get the different subjectives, you know, looking at it.
And so have you used NVivo to do the analysis, or have you done it through the manual way of Word and Excel kind of?
Just manually, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So it's always useful. One of the misconceptions with NVivo is that people feel that just because you've got a software helping you with a qualitative analysis, the software doesn't actually do the analysis. The software is a tool for you to do the analysis. So you still have to do all the analysis yourself and all the coding and everything like that. The software is more like a tool to summarize the information in a nice way. One of the things I have to say with the interviews, because they're predominantly human interactions interviews, it's about not only the interview itself, but it's also about setting, you know, the scene in a way. So I can share. I had a PhD student. He was actually my first PhD student, who was doing his research on a very, very, very sensitive topic back in 2006. And his research was on lobbying of energy companies in the context of the EU. So there is a lot of work around lobbying across the Atlantic in the States. It's a very, you know, well-developed kind of research area. We know exactly the mechanisms that organizations and businesses use to lobby the government. It's much less kind of examined, investigated in the context of Europe. And a lot of the time in European context, when we hear the word lobbying, we almost attach a negative connotation to it. It's almost like the company is trying to gain value. Whilst in reality is not, because a lot of the time what is also there is a process of information sharing between the company and the policymaker in order to inform policy making. And why I'm saying this story is because in his PhD, there is this methodology chapter that he goes to extreme lengths to discuss the way he was setting the scene for the interviews. So he was talking to some very high-level officials, not only in the European Commission, but also in different companies. So, for example, we managed to negotiate access to a gentleman who was effectively the person that was managing the lobbying function of BP, British Petroleum. He was effectively the right hand of the CEO of the organization. And the way we managed to do that was because we had links with the British ambassador in Russia. I was working for Kingston at that point, and I was managing a program in Russia. And I managed to work those connections to get us access to that individual. And because he was talking to these very high-level officials, you know, he couldn't just simply present himself as a PhD student that, you know, was doing some research on lobbying. So he had to present himself in a very professional way and set the scene for these individuals to take his questions and respond to his question in the most appropriate way. So in his methodology chapter, I still remember it, there is a long section about the initial approach. How do you approach someone? How do you contact their secretary, and then almost like what kind of clothes you need to wear when you go and do the interview with them. So, you know, he was telling, what kind of preparation he has done, how they would present themselves to the company, how they would appear for the interview, and try to build that kudos behind them in order to have that social interaction with that individual that otherwise they would treat them all as it's a PhD student, they're going to ask me a few questions and off they go out of the door. So he didn't want to have that approach. So this is something that you always need to take into consideration when you're conducting interviews, that it is a human interaction, and there is the context around that interview that might influence what your participants say, what your participants respond to. There might be also background in participants' lives that perhaps is informing or is blocking certain things. Imagine someone, having 2 kids at home with COVID, trying to balance work at the same time and trying to give an interview to you. You know, the primary attention will be everywhere else but the interview itself. So if you want to pause and give your participant that space, is actually better than actually trying to force your way through the interview. If you're seeing that the participant is not giving you the responses you need, or they're trying to get you through the door, there might be something else that you need to possibly pick there and you know, in an honest way, discuss and give them another opportunity to participate in your research, should they wish so. The other thing which is always important is that the interview is a conversation that with the end of the interview, a lot of the time we need to return back to our participants, and obviously that's not something that happens when you have a single interview, but when you have multiple interviews, we need to return back to participants in order to verify things they said, in order to check things that other participants might have said. So the concluding bit of the interview is not simply a goodbye, but it's, you know, perhaps I can get in touch with you in order to verify your views. It's always good practice and best practice to send the participants the transcript, so they can basically verify it themselves and they can read it and ensure that their views are represented appropriately, and they might not have said something that they don't want to say. So it's really important to give them that opportunity to revisit the content of the interview and tell you, yes, I'm happy for all this information to be processed and everything like that. And it's also one of those cases, and obviously you didn't have the opportunity because you've only done one interview. It's not the case where you do all the interviews and then start doing the transcription. The qualitative analysis is more of an iterative process. So the practice is that you do a couple of interviews, you sit down, you transcribe them, you look for the different themes, you look at whether you have covered everything you need to cover. You might want to rephrase certain questions, you might want to change slightly your schedule of the interview before you progress, and perhaps, you know, return back to the first interviewees if you need, in order to be able to extract all the information that you need. So don't feel that, you know, it's not like the quantitative where you collect your data, you then do your analysis, you do your regression, you do your ANOVAs, and out of the way, it's done. It's more of an iterative process where you do analysis, you go back, you revisit the analysis, you might have other themes. So imagine you've got a special participant that you interview fourth in line, let's say, and that participant through that interview emerges a very interesting theme. What you need to do is you need to go back and look at for this theme in the previous 3 interviews to see whether there was something similar to that was raised from those participants as well. So it's really, really important to keep it as a process where you go backwards, forwards a lot of the time in order to get rich information. And also, one of the misconceptions with this kind of data collection and analysis is that you need to do a lot in terms of interviews. So if someone asks me, what am I supposed to do? You know, 10 interviews of 20 minutes each, or 3 interviews of 1 hour each, my view would probably be leaning towards do the 3 interviews of 1 hour each, because you engage with your participants in a much more solid way. You're extracting a lot of information, you're getting into their minds, and you're having that flow. Whilst in the 20 minutes, even if you interview 10 participants, you might simply say hello, goodbye, and that's basically it. So it's not about numbers. You could see, PhDs being published and PhDs being passed with a small number of interviews. Obviously, the norm is that you would get about 20 to 25 interviews for a PhD, but in reality, you could still do it with 10 interviews if those interviews are rich enough and they're giving you what you need to be getting from your participants. So don't feel like, oh, I need to to conduct a lot of interviews. It's more about getting in depth than actually getting the spread there. So I will be talking a bit about, interviewing, and as I said, the initial point that this is not a survey. It's a conversation. It has to flow, and you need to think about also the time you might be spending for each respondent. You might want to adjust your time accordingly. It might be driven by the participant's diary. It's very different talking to a CEO who probably doesn't have, plenty of free time, so you need to be much more focused in what you're asking them than someone else who's in more casual kind of position, and they can basically get that. So very similar to what I said about the survey and the pilot. If you have your schedule, if you basically have your questions, try out some of those questions on friends, get the feedback before you actually go on the field and asking them. It's really, really useful to get a sense of how the conversation flows and what is happening and how it's moving and everything like that. And as I said, think of it as an opportunity for the respondent to tell their own story on their own terms. So it's not you, it's them who need to speak through the interview. I think Sarah mentioned it earlier in terms of how much you speak during the interview and how much the respondent speaks, which is really, really important. It's their story, it's their views that you need to solicit. It's also quite important that think about recording and transcription. And obviously our memory has this natural limitation. So despite the fact that a lot of people say, I'll do interviews and I'll keep notes, it's always useful to record, because the recording allows you, and obviously the recording has the extra time that you need to go back and do the transcription and everything like that. But first of all, you can then repeat the examination of the different answers. It's far more transparent because you can then evaluate the analysis through other researchers, secondary analysis. And obviously, you can counter any accusations that it has been biased or it has been influenced. And the data can actually be reused as long as you have the informed consent of the participants in order to do that. I also feel that the researchers should be doing at least part of the transcription. Obviously, there are a lot of transcription services. There is even software that can do the transcription for you now. But as you do the transcription a lot of the time, you start thinking about the different themes, you start thinking about how you can codify the data, you start thinking about the conversation, that the conversation is flowing. So yes, I do say, if you conduct 40 interviews, you don't need to do the transcription of all 40 because it might be a very lengthy exercise. But at the same time, you might want to do a significant part of that as part of your research training and as part of the ability to understand what it says. So try to get, if you're doing interviews, try to get participants' consent to record them. You can use your mobile phone, you can use a dictaphone, you can use whatever you like. These days, technology is very good. If you do them online, because this is something that we have done over the last couple of years, especially with COVID, a lot of doctoral researchers did interviews online. And obviously, if you do it through Zoom, if you do it through Teams, you can always record that and get a transcript quite easy out of it. So try to get that recording into place. Now, what are the characteristics of a successful interviewer? And what I ask you here to do is reflect on those characteristics and how you can develop them in the context of appearing for an interview. So first one is you need to be knowledgeable. So you need to know what you're talking about, and you might want to do a couple of pilot interviews there, so you're familiar with the focus, what you need to extract. You need to be structuring, so you need to give purpose, ensure that the interviewee has understood everything, they don't have any questions, you can round it off in a way that, you know, it feels like you're closing that conversation, but perhaps you're opening up the next chapter. Clear, and this is where the jargon is really important. We tend to, as academics as well, we tend to interview people and we tend to use a lot of our terminology, and a lot of the time we fail to understand that, you know, we need to convert sometimes our terminology in layman's term in order to be able to get proper interviews. And it's also really, really important if the person that you're interviewing is using jargon, or they're using, for example, acronyms. You go into a business, happens very frequently. Carolina, that might be really important for you. You go into an accounting firm and they have all these acronyms. Feel free to ask, you know, what does this stand for? What do you mean with that? You know, what this acronym means. It's like, because otherwise you end up in a situation where you note down all these acronyms, but you don't actually know what they mean and how they're used in the conversation. Gentle. It's really important. I've done an exercise a few years back with dyslexic students. And one of the important things is that as people, as human beings, we have this natural tendency to cover the gap of silence. If there is a long pause, you almost have this natural inclination to jump into and say something. Don't. Leave your participants space. The fact that they are not saying something, it means that they might be thinking about it. They might be, and sometimes people do that process, not necessarily saying, oh, I'm now thinking about it, let me think about it. They might just do it naturally. So don't feel that always a pause is something that you need to jump into and start asking, banging them with questions. Let them have their time. Take that into consideration when you're timing the interview as well, because these gaps, they're going to be recorded. These gaps are going to be part of your time that you're interviewing. And obviously, you might have very different styles of people. Show empathy as well. You don't need to show sympathy. You need to show empathy. You don't need to see that you don't need to show that you definitely agree, but you need to demonstrate that you understand what they have been going through, especially when it comes to sensitive topics. You need to be open, so you need to respond to what is important and demonstrate flexibility. And also, you know, what I think Piers mentioned it in the very beginning, you know, you need to have your end goal there. You know what you want to find out. Sometimes you might want to also be critical. The interview is not a process where you're supposed to be, obviously you need to be gentle with your interviewee, but if you realize that there have been some inconsistencies there, you need to be prepared to challenge them and say, look, 3 minutes ago you told me that, and how do you basically, in a polite way, how do you basically make the two ends meet here, because you've said something completely different now. And that characteristic is always important in relation to the 9, which is remembering, in the sense that you need to remember what has been said throughout the interview and retract that information and bring it forward and challenge it. Sometimes you need to be able to interpret, especially when the interviewee is dealing with or presenting complex constructs. You need to clarify and extend what they mean, not interpret, not imposing your meaning on them, but basically in your own words try to tell them what they've said, so you can basically get a positive or a negative. I think Sarah mentioned it earlier, balanced, not talk too much, but at the same time not talk too little, because you don't maintain the flow of the conversation. And ethically sensitive. We've talked about ethics in the very beginning. Ethical dimension interviewing, talk to their interviewee what the research is about, what the purpose is, and how their answers will be treated. So think of these characteristics as you prepare yourself for the interview. Think about these characteristics as you're effectively doing the interview in order to be able to get the best out of your participants. So it's really an interpersonal encounter where you need to demonstrate a range of social skills. And this is why I'll tell you something interesting here. It has come through in the selection process for these projects. And some of these projects require interviewing. And when it did require interviewing, in the selection process, in the criteria that we used, we took that into consideration. You know, how far the person that we're selecting has the right social skills to conduct those interviews, because it's really important. It's the fit of the researcher with the project. It's no point having, you know, a researcher that doesn't fit with the project. So social skills of empathy, warmth, attentiveness, humor where appropriate, and consideration are essential. You don't go with any judgmental attitude, because anything like that will be immediately detected and will put your interviewee in a kind of negative connotation. And you should never answer on their behalf. So keep track of the questions, but maintain the flow. And you can always use this kind of active listening technique, where you basically show if you want to find something more about a particular thing, you can always probe them. We use probes. I think Sarah mentioned this challenge around getting the information and not getting closed answers to questions. So you always use probes, but the interesting probes are those that make the participant feel that they have something to say. So, oh, tell me more about that. Oh, this is really interesting. Could you please explain more? So you give it a positive spin, and then the participant gets excited about them talking to you. I've mentioned the silence issue. So let them think. And if you need to break away from the interview guide and follow the respondent. So if you have to make a decision, do I follow my interview guide or do I follow my respondent? The answer is always follow your respondent. You can bring up your respondent back to your interview guide, but if you lose your respondent, you've lost them. So it's really, really important. And I know it's a challenge, but try not to think about time. Relax into the interview. It is a challenge because time is of essence, because you need to get through your questions as you go through. But at the same time, you don't want to, if there is an interesting point and an interesting conversation that is happening about a particular issue, imagine that you might not be able to get that information from anyone else. So you will still have information from all other respondents about other questions. If there is a particular participant that is passionate about something and they want to talk about that something, let them talk about it, because they're giving you very rich information. So, 2 sets of guidelines. Simple questions, not double questions. So, one thing at a time. Then also, do not ask questions that can be answered with one word. I think that's a challenge. Do not ask questions that require your respondents to do the analysis for you. It's your job to do the analysis. It's their job to share their experiences. And do not ask them to give you hearsay. So don't ask them what other people think. It's not their job to tell you what other people think. It's their job to tell you what they think. So a wrong question here is, what do people around here think of X? They won't be able to tell you, or even if they tell you, it's their interpretation. It's more about, what do you think around X? And also, don't be afraid to ask embarrassing questions. If you don't ask, they won't tell sometimes. So perhaps it's also a matter of staging it. You don't start with an embarrassing question or a sensitive question, because you automatically put your interviewee into some form of defensive state. But as the interview flows, and as you have reached the point where you have gained rapport and trust with your interviewee, you can start entering into the more challenging, more difficult questions. Okay, so try to think about questions in the beginning that will ease you into that. It's the typical thing, like every conversation, why do British people talk about the weather? Because talking about the weather doesn't have any political connotations, or it's not going to get you anywhere wrong. You know, legal rights of abortion, you might actually end up in a very conversation depending on your on the person you're talking to. Direct questions are also preferred questions. Examples there: do you find it easy to keep smiling when you're serving customers? Are you happy with the way you and your husband decide how money should be spent? And again, these questions should be left towards the end in order not to influence. Indirect question: if you want to ask about hearsay, so for example, like that, what do most people around here think of the ways that management treats its staff? You can then follow it up. Is that the way you feel too? So you can basically get a contrast between their perspective and the perspective they feel other colleagues feel. Obviously, there are points where you need to get the conversation moving. So a very good probe there is, I would now like to move on to a different topic. You do that, you pause there and you say, we're moving there. You're giving them also the opportunity to have a natural break to their thought. If you want to do follow-up questions, you could say things like, could you say some more about that? What do you mean by that? Or that's very interesting. I would like to hear more. The probing ones are the ones that follow up usually what has been said through direct questioning, where you're telling them what they've said to you and you follow up with that. You could also have specifying questions if they talk about experiences, if you want to get more out of those experiences. And also, as I said, this interpreting question, you can basically tell them what they have said to you, repeat it back to them and get them to think about how you have interpreted it in a way. So it's always useful to hear other people describing our words, because you can then see whether you have communicated the message appropriately, and it gives you kind of a wake-up call if you want to say something completely different, or if your message has been misinterpreted. So these are kind of the guidelines you need to think about. Now, how do you do it in practice on a step-by-step? You need to start with what we call the large questions and outline the broad areas of knowledge that you need. These are the major areas. Then you need to develop questions within each of these major areas, and perhaps if you have different respondents, shape them to fit. You might decide, I don't know, Sarah and Piers, are you going to do different groups of participants in terms of interviewing?
Yeah, we have slightly different interpretations of a very similar question, so we're going for different demographics.
Yeah, so that's exactly that. So you've got the major areas, and you shape the questions, and you slightly change the way those questions are being handled to address the two different audiences. And of course, you know, adjust the language of the interview depending on who you're talking to, whether it's a child, a professional, someone who has more of a technical expertise or not. It's always interesting to think about that fifth kind of step, about the how versus the why, because the how, the use of how puts your participants into thinking about the story behind or the process behind, rather than the rationale. You know, why do you think that, or why did you do that? Or it's very different, because they're going to tell you, you know, the dry part. The how is almost inviting them to think about and explain to you about the process, not the reason. And in the interview, it's not about finding the reason. It's also about finding what has been the thinking process behind this whole kind of approach they have focused. And obviously, you then need to think about probes that elicit detailed and elaborate responses. The probes is usually something that you will pick up as you go along the interview. It's not always something that you can prepare a lot in advance. And begin always the question with the interview with a warm-up question. It might be, for example, you can tell them a bit, you can ask them to tell them a bit about their CV, you know, how they, so in the context of think manager, think male, you can ask them about, you know, what has been their career progression to get to that point. So it's a very easy way of them telling you a bit about their story, and perhaps you might be picking up things there that are quite useful. So think about this warm-up question. What is the question that will open up your participants? And of course, the logical flow, going back to number one and number two, you know, what topics should come first, what follows naturally, and then you can adjust that depending on the interviews and the interview flows. As I said, difficult questions, more embarrassing questions towards the end when you have extracted a lot of the information, and obviously the last question is about closure, and leave the respondent feeling empowered, listened to, or glad that they talk to you. And that it's always useful to say, you know, I really enjoyed this conversation I had with you. I feel your expertise and your experience is going to be beneficial for my project. Would you mind if I contact again, if I get in touch with you and, you know, test a few of the findings of this study? This is really empowering for the interviewee, because you give them the sense that they have contributed, but you're also, you know, value their experience, and you're happy you're happy to share your findings and you know, get verification of your findings through them. So it's something that you really put them in a very good mood if you want to follow up, and it's giving them the best closure experience for the interview. Any questions so far? Any practical things that you might have found challenging in the past, or you might want me to tell you whether I can draw from my experience and tell you anything more?
I think a lot of the things I was concerned about, you've actually kind of covered, in terms of it's okay to focus more on rapport building and allowing the conversation to go where it needs to go, rather than be really like distracted by your questions and only thinking about what questions you want to ask and missing out on what could be really rich data from your participants. So that's quite reassuring. And the fact that the number of participants doesn't have to be, because we wanted to get up to 10. But so far, I'm not sure I'm going to get that many. I think it might be more like 5 or 6. But you're kind of saying that's okay.
Look, there is one concept in qualitative data. So in quantitative data, it's easier. We can say, you know, if you want the statistical tests to work, you need to get a sample of 30, 40, 50 participants through a questionnaire. Obviously, with numbers, you know, the higher the numbers, the better it is in terms of statistical power and representation. In the context of qualitative studies, the most important thing that someone can implement to say, look, am I okay with what I've done so far, is the concept of saturation. So, and this is why I said it's really important to get this cyclical, this iterative process. If you get to a point where your participants, the only thing they do is repeat things that you have identified through other respondents, there is no point of adding one more interview, because you have reached a good point of saturation. There is actually an argument here that has been used a lot in qualitative studies, where you actually not include certain interviews because you have reached the level of saturation you need, and therefore, you know, the last 2 interviews, perhaps you have transcribed them, you analyze them, but they don't need to be part of your analysis, because you covered what you needed to cover with everything you've had already. So you need to think about this concept of saturation, and have you saturated what you wanted to find out? If you get meaningful answers to the questions you're asking, and you get them from 4 or 5 participants, that's absolutely fine. You don't need to then verify it by 15, because that's not the process of qualitative analysis. Carolina.
Hi, sorry. Could you just give a little bit of advice on like observations, if that's okay?
So the observation is one of the tools you can use together with the interview. Usually the observation is not reflected in the recording, but the observation is usually something that you do as you walk into the natural environment of your interviewee. The observation works really well if you know what you're looking for. So similarly to the preparation for the interview, you need to almost create a list of observations or of things that you need to be looking for. Some of them might be the way the natural space is designed. Some of it might be the way the space of the space of the office of the interviewee is. It might be, for example, in your case, you might be looking at cases where technology is used. You walk into an office, and if you see the traditional receptionist having a notebook in front of them, is very different than actually walking into an office where you see the receptionist with a monitor and a laptop or a big screen behind them with a nice dashboard of the company. So all these things that you can observe, and you can use them then in your analysis as context describing. So you can actually say this firm obviously has far more advanced digital expertise and knowledge because we have observed all these things. So what is really important is, and the literature can help you to that, create a list of what you need to be looking for and have that list with you. And as you go and do your interviews, you can basically tick those boxes and say, I've seen that, I've seen that, I've seen that, I've seen that. And that's part of the observation. The other thing you could do is obviously observation around your participant, your interviewee, which is really important. Obviously, we don't expect you at this level to be experts on body language, but there are certain characteristics of the body language that tell you how your respondent perceive certain type of questions. And you might again have an observation list there where you can basically tick certain characteristics off and say, what usually happens there is you make a note of the time within the interview. So so for example, if your participant starts getting nervous from your questions, you make a note on your piece of paper and saying, participants started behaving nervously after this kind of question. So when you listen to your recording, you can look at your notes and almost recreate the physical environment. Have I answered the question?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, and obviously the observation is part of your data collection, and that holds for Piers and Sarah. When you're doing interviews, it's not simply the dry recording and the dry interview that you do, but it's the observation can actually be part of, you will be walking into organizations. I don't know, are you going to do the interviews online, face to face?
I think they'll be online.
But again, if the participants don't have a blurred background like myself here, you've got a lot of things. So if I remove my blur from my background, you will probably see the room behind me, has two big stools, it has a lot of toys, it has a big television with video games underneath, so you could tell that it's my office, but at the same time it's my playroom with the kids. So you could get a sense of my family circumstances, although I share them. So if you see Lego toys behind me, you could tell, boy, girl, we don't know, but perhaps that age. So you could get a lot of information around your interviewee. So if you do those online and you get the opportunity to observe your participants' background, even the selection of the background, you can even, that's a very interesting question, to open up the conversation. If your participant has selected one of those virtual backgrounds, you could say, oh, that's a very interesting background. If it's not one of those dull Zoom backgrounds, that's a very interesting background. Could you tell me why you decided to choose this background? I used to have a very nice, colorful background of books behind me, looking like a library. And then I found out that it was distracting people, so I stopped using it. But you could sell a lot, and it's a nice warm-up question as well. Right. Anything else around that bit? No? Brilliant. So I can talk a bit about the stages in qualitative data analysis. And then, of course, you can stop me whenever you want, and then show you a bit of NVivo and how NVivo can be. Is anybody doing focus groups? I'm just thinking there's no point of going specifically into focus groups if nobody's doing them. I prefer to spend more time on the interviewing bit. So the most important thing, even if you forget, as I usually say, even if you forget everything we've said so far, if you keep in mind that the qualitative data analysis is an iterative process, is a process of questioning, reflecting, rephrasing, analyzing, theorizing, verifying, observation, and then interview, and then going back again and again and again and again through that process, I would be more than happy. That's the most important thing that you need to take into consideration. It's not a linear process where you go step 1, step 2, step 3. It's a process where you perhaps you need after step 3, go back to step 1 and all over again. So during each interview, what you need to do, first of all, is obtain written informed consent. You don't have to actually do it during the interview. You can do it in your invitation letter, or invitation email. You can clearly explain what the purpose of the project is. You can get that from your supervisor very easily. You can tell them how the data they're going to be sharing with you will be stored, how you're going to be securing the recording and everything like that. Then audio record or video record the interview. You could note down the basic information about each participant, so you can get a sense of their background and what they're doing. And as you go along, you could take additional notes in terms of the environment, observation. There is, again, a very fine balance between note-taking and going with the flow. You shouldn't be feeling that, oh, I need to keep a note of almost everything, because then you're losing the flow of the interview. So during the data collection, you do reading, data immersion, reading and rereading. So it's good to read the interview as you go along, read the transcript, do some coding, listen to the data for emerging things, begin to attach labels or codes to the text. You don't have to do that formally through NVivo, but in your transcript, on the side, you can start looking for themes. The reason behind that is that if there are interesting things, especially if your research has what I would call an inductive element as well, and I imagine in all cases there is an inductive element. So it's not all about theory, hypothesis development, testing of that hypothesis, because that's not always why we use qualitative. It's more about, yes, we've got some theoretical background, we can have an understanding, but at the same time we want to find out more about process. We want to come up with findings that perhaps are not explained by the literature, or phenomenon in your case, Carolina, which are relatively recent and perhaps they might not necessarily have picked up 100% by the literature. So there is this inductive element where you listen to your data as well, and you're trying to get a sense of what your data is telling you. And the reason why you do it almost during every and after every interview is that you don't want to miss an important thing and convert it into a question that you want to actually specifically ask the remaining of your participants. Now, after each interview, you need to scan and upload any interview notes. I usually use OneNote to keep notes for interviews when I conduct interviews, especially with SMEs, in order to avoid having handwritten papers and things like that. You need to keep a file with your informed consent as well. Your audio files, if you transcribing it yourself is fine. If you want to send it to a transcriptionist, or if you want to get it through one of those softwares, do it. Check the interview for fluidity, for flow, and of course, you need to always compare the original, especially if you haven't done the transcription yourselves, you need to compare the original audio file against transcription to ensure accuracy. It's also important if you go down the route of, for example, Teams has this transcription service now, automatic, but most of the time you end up, especially if there are particular terms used, you end up with something completely different in the transcription file, the transcription log, that actually what has been said in the interview. So it's really, really important to cross-check those two. So after the data collection, what you need to do is you need to display the themes, develop the hypothesis, question, verify, and also think about reducing. You're going to have a lot of rich information, and one of the challenges with qualitative research is actually this reduction point where, you know, from all the data that you have collected, to display and talk about the main points, the things, and you will do that with your supervisor, to think about what is really important for the participants, for the reader to know, in that sense. So what is the process? You read, and you read for content here. So it's not bedtime reading. You need to be asking the following questions yourself. First of all, and this is why it's really important to do it after the first, second interview. Are you obtaining the types of information you intend to collect? Are you getting the answers you expect to get, or are you getting the answers you expect to get in order to analyze them? Are you getting themes that perhaps you haven't necessarily developed or built on the existing literature? Are you getting emergent themes? And are these really crucial? Are these things that you need to pursue further with other participants, and perhaps start thinking about tentative explanations? And note these new topics that perhaps need to be explored in further fieldwork. One of the important things you need to bear in mind here is, because you're going to be working as researchers, just because something is not part of your project, it doesn't mean that it's worthless. It could be that it's something is really, really important, is not part of your project, but you make a note for that because this could be actually a very interesting avenue for further research. And thinking about the future and thinking about putting proposals together and thinking about pursuing scholarships and all these things, these are quite interesting things because it gives you now a good opportunity to engage with the field, to engage with participants out there, to get views. So you've got a very good opportunity here to start thinking about things which are underexplored, and you can easily get them in further research proposals. You also need to look at the quality of the data you have. You know, have you obtained superficial responses? Have you got rich and deep responses? If your observations, you know, have you got vivid and detailed description of observations? The observations can be from a tick list to almost like a photographic memory of the place. And then, of course, have you got enough contextual detail? You know, what is the context of conducting this interview and everything like that? So if you identify any problems that, you know, the responses you get are not deep, perhaps, you know, you're not getting a rich environment, you might want to think about how you're asking questions. Obviously, if you do it online, you can't change the venue. The venue is the venue. You might start thinking about composition of groups if you're doing something along groups. You're doing recruitment of participants, which is really, really crucial. But you also need to think about the style of the characteristics of you and the way you interact with your participants. I don't know whether you've got that opportunity because you are almost a double act there, Sarah and Piers, whether you can cross-share some of the interviews depending on the type and the characteristics of the interviewer. And the way you might interact with certain type of participants. It might be a good, given that you're working on a single project, it might be something that you can think about whether, you know, Sarah, you can build more rapport with certain type of participants, whilst Piers, you can build more rapport with other types of participants, and therefore you might want to share that and exchange interviews in a way. And of course, you know, how soon after the activity your notes are recorded is really, really important. Don't leave it, 2 weeks. I usually, when I do interviews, I usually sit down quite quickly after the interviews are conducted and create a file, complementary file with all the notes, all the information, all the observation, the informed consent together with the audio file and the transcription. So I have all that information together and I can use it. So that's almost like developing a system to identify problems in the data. Now, as I said, you read here to identify patterns and examine how those themes are patterned. So do you get themes in all data that you have, in some data, in some participants and not in others? Are there any relationship within themes? So for example, this is directly relevant to the flow of the conversation. So it's almost as if, think about it this way, and qualitative analysis is not always easy to explain because sometimes it has to do with the experience of the researcher. But one of the things I do following the interview is I create almost like a mapping of the flow, a mapping of the themes in the interview. So, where that was mentioned, where the next theme was mentioned, where that was mentioned, where the two or more themes mentioned in the same answer. And what I do is I look at the mapping of those themes in a single participant's interview, and then I contrast it with the next, and then the next, and then the next. So I look almost like, it's almost as if I'm looking at the flow of the conversation and looking at whether every single interview had exactly the same. Remember, they all have the same starting point, which is the structure, your questions and the structure. Now, it's very interesting to see whether participants, through their discussion and through their responses, have forced you to change that, and they might have said things in slightly different ways. And you can create that mapping of the different themes and the different concepts in the interview and contrast them one to the other, and then also enrich it with some contextual information there and find explanations. Is it clear what I'm saying? Okay. And of course, that will also help you identify contradictory responses, people that might have come from different perspectives, and, either contradictory responses within the interviews or contradictory responses across the interviews. Remember, when you're doing the analysis, you've got two dimensions that you need to be looking. You need to be looking within the interview and the way the person has responded, but you can look across the interviews, across the same theme or across the same responses, to look at the way different people have responded to those questions. And of course, whether there are gaps in our understanding which might require further exploration, and you put that aside and you say, perhaps that's something that we can explore further in the future. Now, what do we use? I've mentioned the words theme, code, and concept a lot of the time. So this is a definition. The code is the name of the tag which is assigned to an interview excerpt representing an idea. So you usually put a code next to a specific section of the interview. Again, here there is a very interesting balance between how long those sections should be. I've seen coding ranging from a line to half a page. Now, I would seriously question whether half a page is appropriate for a code, because you get a lot of information there. So I think you need to be enforcing yourselves to be as restrictive as possible when it comes to the code and the coding. Don't, just because the person has said a lot, don't actually feel that you need to get the whole expert. Just focus on those sentences or on those phrases that represent what is really important. Then you bring codes together, and you have this concept, and you then have a name for idea assigned to a group of concepts. So you then take it a step higher, then you name The name for an idea formed from the base of categories is a theme. And of course, you can then have what we call a code book, which is a data dictionary of codes that used to develop themes. So it's almost like a mapping of the different things. Now, I don't know how far you're going to have time to do that, but because it's an iterative process, usually when it comes to doctoral thesis, what we expect to see from a methodological point of view is the different iterations of coding. So researchers, for example, start with one coding and one mapping, and then you might say, look, we've done 3 interviews and then we've done 4 interviews. We decided to change things like this. We decided to change the different associations between concepts, and we decided to delete this theme or create this theme or break this theme into 2 more themes because it required further clarity. And you demonstrate how that changes. It's very good for, you know, transparency and for audit purposes, because it actually demonstrates exactly what has been the process of analyzing your data. As I said, I don't know whether you're going to have time to do it as part of this placement, but in a doctoral thesis, you would expect that definitely to take place. So read the transcript, read and open the code transcript, establish the consensus of codes, repeat steps 1 to 3, develop the draft code book, that code transcripts using the code book, and you go down the route of refining code book iteratively. So you have this iterative process where your first iteration might be different from your second iteration, the third, and at some point you reach to this point of stability in terms of your coding, and then you can move on and code all the different interviews. So select and read, consider big ideas, take notes. Apply codes to specific experts that represent ideas in the interviews to initiate the preliminary code list. There are no standard rules of how to code. Emergent is one, borrowed from existing studies. You might want to record the coding decisions, what is the definition, in order to revisit that if you're going through the next interviews. Most of the time, the first time you do it, you insert them into the margin, and then you start building theme-related files. Also, NVivo gives you quite a lot of flexibility in doing that. Now, the code can usually be one of the following. It can be something related to experience, something related to a relationship, something related to a perspective. It could be just a descriptive type or a setting. So it's a label which is assigned to this text, and usually it's one of those things. Very unlikely you will find something completely out of those 5. So it's a code which is either related to the experience, the relationship, the perspective, the descriptive, or the setting of the interview. The consensus is, and ensure that you have this stability, or eventually your coding system becomes stable. You don't change, you don't add, you don't delete, and you then are certain when to use one code. So when you do the analysis, when you do the coding of your data, you know that this is the code you need to be using and not the other one. So how do you build consensus? The way you build consensus is through this iterative process. You do it once. Obviously, in the case of Sarah, Pierce, and Danny, they have the opportunity to almost like triangulate, because they can do it in between the 3 of them. I don't know how the project will be managed, but you can even do it in between the 3 of you, and you can basically ensure that you talk the same language in terms of your coding, and you can share each other's perspectives and do all that. You have been practicing it anyway in your undergraduate studies. So that iterative process is what builds that stability. And this is where you basically have the code book. Sometimes you can basically have the code book like that. So the mnemonic, which is the name, the brief description, which is what the code is about. How do you decide to include certain things under that code, and how do you decide to exclude certain things, and then a couple of examples. And then you can see whether there are any subcodes underneath there. So that's a code book you can develop. And then, of course, you use that code book in order to transcribe and code the next of the transcripts. There might be cases, as I said, despite this iteration and despite establishing consensus to refine the code book, you go back and you do it. You can demonstrate that as part of your methodological kind of analysis. Now, yes, Jade.
Should a code be like one word, or should it be like a sentence kind of describing the line?
So the mnemonic, if I go back here, when you discuss the mnemonic, should be one word. Or you try to make it as condensed as possible, and then in the description you can explain what that one word means. Okay. Usually, coding. This is why we call it coding. It's not more than a couple of words, because otherwise it becomes more of a sentence, which defies the purpose of having it as a code. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So the way you present this, and this is always a very difficult thing with qualitative analysis, because there is no right or wrong way of displaying your results and presenting your results. It's more about convincing your readers about your story, and the story that you're not actually, I'm sorry, I'll correct myself, not your story, the story of your participants. You're not telling your story. What you're telling is your task to tell the story of your participants. That's the really important thing with qualitative analysis. So there are different ways you could do that. Discuss, for example, how themes might relate. So you can look at through the different interviews through the different participants and say, these themes relate like that, and these themes emerge when this theme was mentioned, or this particular area, so on and so forth. You can also discuss a conceptual model where you look at relationships between those themes and develop them. Or if you have a conceptual model, you can basically look at the propositions of that conceptual model and how they are verified or not by the themes, which is the next one, discuss applying the themes to another existing framework. And also you can discuss the writing of manuscript, how might be the flow that tells the story. If you have a story, I can give you an example. I examined a few years ago a very interesting PhD thesis. It wasn't actually a PhD, it was what we call a doctoral in business administration. So it was a professional doctorate. So the professional doctorates are doctorates where people that currently work engage in PhD studies, and they contribute not only to knowledge, but they contribute to practice. And they were the topic they were investigating was around the development of strategies in family businesses and small and medium enterprises. And the way they decided to present their findings was almost like the story of the different organizations from a family perspective, and the way the family had engaged in strategy development and looked at the competition and developed the resources internally. So it's almost like they presented it in 6 mini case studies, and they took the interviews, they convert them into mini case studies, and they were talking about the story of every organization in a case study. And that made it very interesting, because you could almost see the company coming to life through that discussion. It was not like, and person X said Z in that interview, or person Y said that in their interview. It was more like conversion of the interviews and the transcription and the findings to a story of the organization and how the organization engaged with strategy. And I found that it was one of the most interesting doctoral theses I've ever read. So it has to do with the way you feel comfortable with and the way you think it will get your participant story out. And the other thing, which obviously it's quite interesting to consider, and I'm not saying you need to do it is that obviously so far, doctoral researchers, we are used to present our findings and present everything in paper format. And there are so many other ways of engaging and disseminating results, like podcasts, like videos, things like that, that perhaps you want to, as we're going into this new technological era, perhaps you might want to consider and talk to your supervisor about doing something, you know, where the presentation of your results is out of the ordinary. So for example, combine it with pictures, get permission from, you know, Carolina, get permission from the companies to use their pictures from their offices or to use things like that from their websites and create a podcast of dissemination of your findings. So it doesn't have to be, you know, everything on paper. It could be, there could be other ways, especially because you're not submitting a doctoral thesis, you're doing a research project. And I think the purpose of that research project is also to disseminate results to the wider community. What is really, really important is to describe in very detail the methodology you have used. Is really, really important. I said in that doctoral thesis I talked to you about earlier with the lobbying, Robert basically described even to enter the offices because he wanted to demonstrate that, you know, it was solid research. You know, the person that was hosting them, they could see them as a serious researcher, so on and so forth. Consider obviously the academic and cultural context of your findings, and then go back and describe why they're important to the literature, how they apply to policy and or practice. Think of ways of disseminating those results further to the wider public. I think, you know, all projects that you're doing, when I initially read them, through the competition of the supervisors, I said, these are amazing projects. They're cutting edge. They have a really important thing to say to not just to the academic community, but to the wider public. So you've got very good opportunities there to establish yourselves as some area. So how do we display the data? We look at the variations of each theme. We might note differences. And you know, you then can present the data on a different ways of mapping through tables, through en vivo maps. I'll show you one or two things there that you can basically use a few figures to bring the data to life. So once you've done that, you know, you then start thinking, okay, what's next? A lot of the time we use the data to develop hypotheses further, especially when you're doing quantitative and qualitative research. I don't know, I don't remember, Sarah and Danny and Piers, how your project will work like. Is it that, are the two things, the quantitative and the qualitative, disconnected? Are they connected somehow? Are you going to triangulate one with the other? How are you going to do it?
I think they sort of,
No, go, it's fine.
Go, Danny.
so they sort of link into each other in a sense. So Sarah's is like the first project where she will be interviewing people that are already in male-dominated roles and have had role models. Then Piers will be interviewing students and exposing them to vignettes and hoping to sort of, evoke something in them. And then I'm doing the quantitative side as like the third and last project, for which I'll be using hypotheses. And I think we've decided on ANOVA for that one.
And you're building on the findings of the interviews anyway for the questionnaire, yes?
We can't really, because we don't have time to wait for them, but we'll try and sort of anticipate what the findings could likely be and sort of go off of that.
But you can always triangulate, so you can find what Sarah's participants have said, and then how those spark things to peers interviews, and how the student population and the findings from those interviews correspond or not correspond with what you're finding from a wider sample that you're recruiting through Prolific. Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's the bit. So all these things is like you can return to it from different perspectives, and you can look at the ideas, you can look at information which contradicts, which you can look at pieces of information which are missing or they're not developed. You can find contrasting things across the different approaches to the project, and that might spark further research. And then of course you might say, okay, we need to look not only at students, but we need to look at other populations as well, perhaps professionals. One of the things which possibly could be very interesting in your project is to see whether perceptions of people change depending on the state of their career, the stage of their career. So when you're entering your career ladder, whether you have a different perspective as when you're getting more to leadership and more management kind of positions, and whether there is a difference there in the perspectives. And you could always do the data reduction, so you only present the most essential concepts and relationships, and you think what are the important things I need to be presenting, and the use of visual devices with matrices, diagrams, and summarizing the information in a way. There's always an element of interpretation, and it's always the most difficult thing to write in qualitative projects, because you need to tell the participant story. So you need to keep always an eye on remaining consistent with the data you have collected, that what you're saying in the text it's verified with respondents and their responses. You can basically also present the multiple perspectives. You're not hiding the minorities view there, and of course answer the question, did you go beyond what you expected to find, which is especially important in qualitative studies. Right. I hope that was a useful bit around interviewing, where I brought examples from my experience as well. Are there any questions on this bit? Nope. Right. Let me just close this one. Okay. I can show you a bit of NVivo if you like. So the question here is, how many of you're going to be using NVivo? Are you will be using NVivo to do the analysis or not?
I will.
Okay. Sarah Pierce?
I think so, yeah. I think we've talked about using it, yeah.
Let me bring it up then. Now it's a very, let me say two things first. First thing is that NVivo is a tool. So NVivo is not going to do the analysis for you. Okay, so that's really, really important to understand. The second really important thing to understand is that it is a very complex piece of software. It has a lot of videos online that you can basically go and watch, but it's not the easiest software to navigate. So there is always a balance. So let me just start by sharing. So do you see my application, the application here? Yes? All right. So it's not the most easy software to navigate into. So there's always a fine balance between utilizing NVivo for your analysis and the benefits you get from NVivo, and also the cost of learning the software and working with the software. So my view is that if, Sarah, you came to the point where you had 5 interviews, 6 interviews, I think it's debatable whether by using NVivo, you're gonna make your life easier than actually go down the traditional coding with Word and Excel kind of way. Because learning the software and uploading the information is straightforward, but learning the software and navigating through the software is probably going to take you more time to learn. So it's a decision. I won't make that decision with you. It's a decision you will have to make with your supervisors. As I said, there are a lot of videos there, but it's always, for me, it's always questionable whether if it was for a PhD project, I would say yes, go and do it. But if it's for more of a kind of mini project and you've got probably about a month, I remember you're probably going to be leaving at the beginning of August. If it's more of a month, I think the cost of learning the software is probably bigger than the benefit you're going to have. So let me say it's the way NVivo works is around projects. So you create a project, you work through that project to analyze, upload, analyze the information. I have a project here already, so I can tell you the background of this one. When we did this survey of SMEs, the same survey or a similar type of survey was conducted across another 6 European regions. Each of those regions, they were all part of an Interreg project. Each of those regions generated the report. So we were tasked by Kent County Council to review the reports and identify common patterns. So it's more like, it's not interviewing, but it's more like a textual analysis here that we were asked to do. So we created this project. So I'll open it up. Hopefully technology won't let me down. So, and you can see here under the classifications of region, we've got the different reports from the different regions. So on this side, you've got the options you have, the quick access option. So it's effectively, this side is very similar to a condensed way of this side here. And here you can see, you know, what kind of data you've got. So these are all my files that I have uploaded. Think of it as transcripts in your case. So each one of them responds to a report. You can see how many references there are. So references, NVivo refers to references as points where you can you have identified through codes. You can see the file classifications. So there's nothing there. It's whether you've got attributes, so descriptive information about those data files. We haven't put anything there because it wasn't, but if you do transcript in the file classification, you can start using things like the attributes of your participants, you know, the company, a bit of information around the company and everything like that. And what we have identified here is the case classification, which is the region, because we wanted to ensure that, you know, each region, because there were more than one reports for each region was clustered as one. So what you have here is you can start organizing this data in codes. So here I haven't done any coding yet with them. I've just uploaded. But if I open a file, for example, let me say I open the let's say we open the Kent file. By double clicking, it goes onto your file. It opens up that specific file. It's taking longer than expected. And what you can start doing there is you can start developing has frozen now. You can start developing your coding, and what you will do is you will see that once you start doing that, NVivo will start building codes. You can then look at developing relationships between codes. So you can say this code leads to that, or this code is linked with that code, and that code is linked with that code. And what in reality is going to happen at the end, once you've done all the things we've discussed, is NVivo will be able to bring the information you have done with the coding together. So there it is. So you can see here, this is the file for Kent. Let's say you want something around perception of export activity and the way respondents have talked about it. What I can do here is you can basically highlight that, and you can then code it, code the selection, and you can name it perception. So here, create new top level code. So I've now highlighted this bit here as a new code, which is, export activity. I can go to, for example, this report, and then find out similar information around export activity and code it. So you will see that that will open the next file next to this one. This is more of a presentation. So let's say let's say this is again export activity. So you can basically code it to recent codes. So if I click onto codes here, you can see it has brought me the export activity. If I click on the export activity, what it does, it's gonna open a new tab. And on that new tab, it will bring me together all the codes, all the extracts I have from the different parts of the coding. So in reality, what it does, it then lets you summarize. So technically, all the work you need to do anyway, so you need to code everything yourself, and then the only thing, well, what you gain is obviously a summary, because it brings together all the different findings. It tells you exactly where it has been referenced from. So these are all active hyperlinks, and what it does, it brings you the exact excerpt. So you can basically look at each one of them, and you can compare them, and you can look at them, so on and so forth. And obviously, once you start developing relationships here, you can then start looking at bringing different codes together with different perspectives, and start doing an analysis. It has some very interesting functionality, which we use. Let me just, and the other interesting functionalities around word frequencies that we use. I use it very, most of the time for some preliminary analysis. So what you could do is you can have a word frequency. So look at how many times a word appears into a report. So for example, here I want to only have the top 100 words with minimum length of 5, and I want to have quite a high generalization. So what it does, it groups words with similar meanings together. So what it will do is will bring me a word cloud of the different words from the different reports in a summary. You could do it for every report on its own. You could do it across the different transcriptions. It's always nice as a presentation of information type of thing, and as a preliminary tool of analysis, because you get a sense of which are the concepts that your participants have mentioned quite a lot. Let me just select items. Fewer. So okay, and run the query again. So you can select which transcriptions or which documents you might want to present here. It also has some functionality that allows you to, depending on the language, cluster transcriptions together. So what it does some semi-automatic analysis of the language used in transcriptions, and says the language used in this transcription and the language used in this transcription in terms of the respondents are close to each other. They tend to use the same words, they tend to use the same concepts. And what it does, it basically clusters the different files. Obviously, you know, the more files you've got, the more transcriptions you've got, the better it is. The fewer transcriptions so if you've got 5 transcriptions, I don't think it's worth doing that exercise. But if you've got 30 transcriptions or 20 transcriptions, it's actually quite interesting, because you can then put it together. So this is basically, it has done the analysis. So you can see here the different words. So export countries, COVID, you can see how big COVID has been an important element. Events has been picked up quite a few times. And this is represented then in a word cloud like this. Come on. That's the other thing. NVivo requires quite a fast computer in order to do the analysis quickly, because if you have a laptop like mine, which is a very standard type of laptop, you can tell how long it takes to even analyze 5 or 6 documents here. I haven't asked it to do more than 5 or 6, so it gave me the summary, but in order to give me the word cloud, it takes, yeah, there's the word cloud from all the reports. So it takes a while to actually present you with the information. So this is why I said in the very beginning, it's a very useful tool. It solves your life with regards to coding, because you can code very quickly and then you can get summaries of your codes together. You can start building the relationships, and once you build the relationships, you can basically look at the different codes and how the different codes can come together into themes. But if it's only for 5 or 6 interviews, it's debatable whether it's worthwhile doing it. Any questions on NVivo? Nope. Jade.
So for our project, we're only going to do about 6 interviews. So is there no point in me kind of looking into the software?
I think from a time perspective, you can discuss it always with Spiros. I think the supervisor is always, you know, the first person to discuss this issue with. But my view is that NVivo really provides, well, it depends. If it's 6 interviews of 2 hours each, the answer is probably yes. You might be looking into NVivo as a good tool. If it's 6 interviews of 1 hour, it's a very fine line there. It takes a while even to learn the basics for the software, and depending on the level of the analysis you want to do, you might not have concrete benefits from doing it through NVivo.
Okay, yeah, because I've only got 3 weeks left of my placement, so probably won't have the time to kind of get into it then. But
I think doing the typical approach of Word coding on Word, you can always, what I used to do before NVivo, I was, you can put the line numbers on the side of a Word file. You can color code extracts that you want. You can then associate those colors with particular codes. And what I used to do is I used to then copy paste the extracts onto an Excel file, and I had first column which interview number, second column which line and which section, page and line, and then third column the extract. So you can basically then do exactly the same thing in Excel and bring all the extracts from this particular code together without actually having to go through this whole process of coding it through NVivo, uploading them, trying to do all that. The good thing with NVivo is that it allows you though to code non-paper interviews. So you can always use NVivo to code video files or audio files or things like that, which is not something that you would easily do in a traditional setting, put it this way. But it's always kind of, I'm always questioning the benefit of learning a software like NVivo if it's only for a small piece of work. Right, it's almost 3 o'clock. Question for all of you. Have you visited the VLE? Have you registered for the VLE? No. All right. So what I suggest is I can show you how to go to, perhaps we might not take, are you fine for me moving on and going on to the VLE before without taking a break? Yeah? Okay. So what I'll do is I'll show you where the VLE is, how to access it. You can then try to access it so we can sort out any teething problems you might have as we go along. And then I can also then make sure that you're enrolled onto Sage Campus. Okay? Fantastic. Right. So let me just open a window, Chrome. And share. Right. I hope you can see my send screen. Do you see it fine? Yeah. Okay. Right. The easiest way to go through the VLE is go to sense-dtp.ac.uk. So if you go and visit that address, then you go to resources. And you click on virtual learning environment. Are you all on the screen? Okay. So what you need to do is you need to use the single sign-on. And where it says type the name of your organization, you need to put your institution. Are we all on the same page?
Sorry, I've done that, but it's taken me through to University of Essex for some reason. Even though I've typed University of Kent, clicked on that, but it's taking me through to University of Essex.
Has anybody got exactly the same issue?
Yeah, I have the same thing.
Same thing happened to me too.
So
Yeah.
can I can someone share? I think I've given you access to share your screens. I can stop sharing mine. Can someone share their screen so I can see what you're seeing?
Oh, hang on. Can you see that?
Okay.
So if I go back where I was, so I typed it in there and this came up.
Okay, that's fine.
I click on that, it
Yeah.
takes me there.
Fine. So you can create your profile now.
But though it says University of Essex at the top left there.
That's absolutely fine. University of Essex is the host of the Moodle X website.
Oh, okay, so that's fine.
So you can basically keep on doing that. Go scroll a bit further down, Sarah. Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can all do that and create your profile. Any luck with it?
Yeah, I've set up mine.
Okay. So Danny, have you managed to log into the website to the VLE?
I think so. I've got like my account and stuff, and there's like courses, quick links.
Okay. Would you mind sharing what you're seeing so I can see where you are? That's always a problem with technology, and unless I see where you are, I won't be able to navigate you through. Excellent. Okay, so under courses, if you click under courses, go to my courses basically. Further down, that's it. Okay, so let me see whether I can find you actually onto the say on the Sense VLE. Could you search for Sense VLE or for Sense generally? No results. Let's just see. Sorry, Danny, if you log out from there, okay, go back to the Sense website, yeah, and click on access the main Sense page on the VLE here. That's on the left-hand side. Sorry, right-hand side as you see it. That's the one, yeah. Okay, so click on the Sense, go to self-enrollment. Click continue. Go to the single sign-on now. And go to University of Kent. Okay, does see you enroll me? Yeah, good. So we've done it at least with one of you. So I'm happy because it works. So this is basically the Sense VLE. You don't get you won't have access to Sage Campus, but I should be able to see whether I can get you. Let me just see whether I can see you here. Yeah. So I can see Daniela, I can see Pierce, I can see Carolina. You have all done there. Is that right? Pierce, you can access VLE, the VLE. Carolina,
Yeah,
yes. All right. So let me then see whether I can enroll you onto the Sage suite as well. Okay. All right, so Daniela. Pierce. Okay. Has anybody else? Jade, have you managed to do it?
I clicked enroll. I think it's worked.
Okay, let me see. Yeah, I can see you as well. Sarah, have you managed to do it?
No, I'm just, when it says access the main Send page of the VLE, when I click on that, it just takes me back to like my profile that I was creating, like that page where you
Have
type your name.
Have you created that?
Yeah, I've done that, and it's just
Okay.
said it sent me a link to my email address, which hasn't come through.
Okay.
I had to like verify my email, Sarah, so that might be something that you need
Yeah,
to do.
it's not actually arrived in my email though, so
Danny, since I've got you there, could you just refresh that page, please? Okay, it's not showing up. Search for Sage Campus. All right. Click on the Sage Campus from Sense. Yep. So you now have access to, so this, the rest of you should be able to do exactly the same. So this is what we have so far in terms of Sage Campus. So this is all an online. So the only one that's missing is basically Sarah. I haven't registered Sarah, but once she has verified that address, and we'll see what is the issue. The rest of you should be able to click on Sage Campus, and you should be able to see these modules basically. Danny, you can click on any you want. Go to Fundamentals of Qualitative Text Analysis, for example. So this is the user guide, and then it has 4 modules. You can just click on module 1, which is Introduction to Text Analysis. Yep, so you probably need to allow. Yep, there you are. So this is all online. You can basically go through that. It's basically a module that Sage offers on quantitative text analysis. You can do it on your own time. It has a selection of video presentations, questions, quizzes. Some is more advanced, some is more basic. So it allows you to do it in your own time. And basically go through the different modules. It has quite a few there for you. The research design, for example, is interesting in social data science. It has things around R. So you now get to see that, both of them on your front page. Okay. Now the SENS Doctoral Training Partnership, if you click into that one, this is where I will be creating, where you see those boxes, so you can look at the different things we have there for our students. This is where I will put another box there with slides and video presentations from today's session. So you can look at the training, for example, if you want to do, or the videos, the workshops and webinars. Here we've got everything we have in terms of core methods, research training, all these things. There is a lot of information, so you can, and now you've got access to it forever, effectively. So you can browse and look at what is there. You might find things that are quite useful. Some of it is online, some of it is just additional material and additional information. So there is a lot of things. There are a lot of things that you can go. But I think what's also quite useful is that Sage Campus that you've got now. So workshops and webinars is the other one you could look through. And we've got some upcoming events, things that you might want to register as students coming from a SENS institution. Sarah, any luck?
Yeah, I've just managed it, so I think you should see me there now.
All right, so let me just. Yeah.
I had to just go from the beginning again, but I got there.
I've just added you.
Okay, thanks.
So you can then go and find Sage Campus Suite and use that one.
Where do I find that? Sorry, I missed that.
So if you go into the search box, which is at the top, Daniela, if you put it there, once you click on it for the first time, and you get it, it will appear then on your main page for the VLE.
Okay, got you. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. So with that, I'll let you play with it. If you've got any questions with the VLE, this is where I said, once I have the material ready, I'll put it there and I'll send you an email saying, you know, it's on there. You can revisit it, and you can basically, I'll put my slides and everything we have been discussing today. So any final questions you might have?